UNWLA is almost 95 years old. One of its missions is to educate our communities about Ukraine, which, as we all know, has been much in the news lately. But for Ukraine, as we know, has for much of the 20th century had a pretty tragic history. When the man-made famine occurred in Ukraine in 32-33, ours was still a fledgling organization. But those women did what they could to bring the attention of the world to the horrific events unfolding there. This included writing for help to various politicians, starting with the president, to the press, and to international humanitarian groups. As a result of their work, a resolution introduced on the House floor declared that the Soviets were using, quote, the famine as a means of reducing the Ukrainian population and destroying Ukrainian political, cultural, and national rights, end quote. This may actually have been the first such resolution passed in the House condemning actions taken by the Soviet Union. All these efforts could not stop this man-made famine, which is now known as the Holodomor. And the story of this famine, except amongst Ukrainian diaspora, was mostly lost to the world for more than 50 years, until the USSR fell apart and sealed archives were opened for the world to see. The UNWLA is very grateful to the Holocaust Museum for giving us this opportunity to bring to light here in Southwest Florida what many have come to call Stalin's secret genocide. But the exhibit and today's event are important not just as educational events. They are also important because they have united two groups with a dissonant history. For that reason alone, this exhibit is groundbreaking and hopefully will set an example for further such collaborative activities. Let me make a few introductions before we move on to our speaker. First, Natalie Centrosiero. Where are you, Natalie? She is the president of our branch. Also here today is Natalia Polenko. She is the representative from our national headquarters in New York. Michael Saukiu is the chair of the U.S. Committee for Ukrainian Holodomor Genocide Awareness. Michael. And Ulyana Mazurkevich, a member of the U.S. Commission on the Ukraine Famine, which was established by Congress in 1985. Okay, and now for the reason that we're all here, about our speaker. He is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He is a world-renowned expert on 20th century Central and Eastern European history, on the Holocaust, and on Ukraine. He did his undergrad work at Brown and received a PhD in modern history from Oxford. He is a prodigious writer and scholar, author and co-author of many books, essays, and numerous articles, both scholarly and for the general public. Just this week, he had an article in the New York Times on Hitler and the creation of fake news. His work has been translated into 40 languages, and he has received at least that many awards, prizes, and recognitions. He speaks 5 and reads 9 or 10 European languages, including Ukrainian, and I tested his Ukrainian during lunch. It was pretty good. So that alone, I think, the linguistic capabilities are amazing. He has appeared many times in media around the world, both on TV and radio. His words have been quoted in political demonstrations in several countries, most recently, I believe, in Hong Kong. His most recent book is Road to Unfreedom. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Please welcome Professor Timothy Snyder.
Thank you very much for the kind introductions. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Let me just begin with a couple of reflections about what it means that this event is taking place at all. That's the note I'd like to begin on, and then I will end on that as well. So I'm very grateful for the kind introduction. I'm very grateful to my hosts, the Florida chapter of the Ukrainian Women's League of North America, as well as the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center of Naples. I'm personally touched to have been chosen to deliver this particular lecture, because what we're doing is something which is a bit extraordinary. In fact, I think outside of Ukraine itself, unprecedented, which is introducing an exhibition about the famine in Ukraine of 1932, 1933 in the setting of a Holocaust museum. Now, historians are trained never to say that something is the first or only time, because as soon as you do that, someone writes an angry book review pointing out that, in fact, this happened before. But to our knowledge, this is the first time that in an American Holocaust museum there has been an exhibition about the famine. And this is a very touching moment for me, because these are I'm one of the few people who writes about both of them, and the ways that they can be connected and what both of them tell us about ethics and about politics and about history is a subject which is very close to me. So I just wanted to make sure that I expressed my appreciation for having been chosen to give this lecture. I'm hopeful in a couple of ways. I'm hopeful that I can give a lecture on the Holodomor, which will make it clear to those of you who aren't familiar with it, and perhaps add some dimensions to those of you who are. I'm also hopeful that this is, as Helena already said, that this is the beginning of a larger discussion among Jews, Ukrainians, and others about the history of the 20th century that will serve to help us understand one another as well to understand the past. For those of you who are not Ukrainian, I see two types of people in this audience. There are the people who are aware that Ukraine is the center of the universe, and the people who are not yet aware that Ukraine is the center of the universe. So let me begin just with a few moments on that topic of why Ukraine is so central to the history of the 20th and 21st centuries. As Helena mentioned, you would have to be in some kind of very special news bubble not to be aware that Ukraine is important in American politics right now. What I'd want to suggest is that that's not exceptional. That is, for reasons that I'll talk about a bit later, we don't very often remember how important Ukraine is to history, but that's often because Ukraine is so deep in a history which is so dark that it doesn't remain with us. So it remains to be seen how many people will remember that in the early 21st century, Ukraine was at the center of what I think the major political problems are, which are things like inequality of wealth and cyber war and the difficulty of carrying out democratic elections. This is a whole subject to itself, but I think the main problems of the 21st century are visible, and the main opportunities as well, are visible in Ukraine now. What I want to suggest is that this prominence that Ukraine has in the news, the fact that Ukraine is central to political change in the West, has been true for several hundred years. Ukraine is at the center of the history of Europe and of the West. Basically, at every phase, Ukraine gives some indication of how things are going to go. So those of you who don't want to hear about anything except 1933, I'm not going to say take out your phones because that's very rude. Don't do that. That this is your moment to zone out. Okay. So those of you who already know that Ukraine is at the center of the whole world for the last 1,000 years, you can now think about your grandchildren or whatever. Did that say anything about the demographics of this crowd? Hi, young people. It's a nice corner you got going over there. Okay. So this will be brief, but it's important, because it's important to see that Ukraine isn't just something that springs out into the world in the 1990s or sprung out into our consciousness in 2019. The history of Ukraine is very old, and it's a history which really is central to understanding Europe and the West. I'll just give you a couple of examples. The main theme in medieval European history is the theme of state formation. When particular societies convert to Christianity, and then when states are created on the basis of that conversion. Ukraine is very interestingly at the center of that, or I should say Kiev, which is now the capital of Ukraine, is very interestingly at the center of that. It's a place where Vikings from Sweden encountered Khazars from Central Asia who had, oh, here's one for you, okay. who had just converted to Judaism, it seems. Like, I'm aware there's this whole Hebrew school story about, like, there was the fall of the temple, and then there was Israel, and you don't have to study the parts that are in between. But I am here as a historian to say that you do have to study the parts in between. This is the part of where I figure out who's Jewish in the crowd by how they react to that remark. Okay, I more or less got it. The Khazars had converted to Judaism, it seems. Their elite and this Swedish Viking elite merged with the Slavic-speaking population to create the political class of a medieval state called Rus. This general tendency of forming up a state on the basis of a Christian conversion was the mainstream of European history. The specific variant of the Vikings and the Jews and the Slavs coming together a little bit more than typical. The same is true of the Reformation, the next major turning point in European history. The Reformation in Western Europe is about the Catholics and the Protestants. In Ukraine, it's about the usual suspects, the Catholics and the Protestants, but also a Uniate church, which was Eastern and Western Christianity brought together, and also, of course, local Orthodoxy. So the Reformation is also much more intense and interesting in Ukraine than it is anywhere else. But you need that picture if you want to understand what the Reformation was all about. Relatedly, nationhood, the Cossacks in Ukraine in their rebellion in 1648, which is a very painful memory for Jews, is an example of an early formation of a nation, early national self-consciousness. And Ukraine was also in the middle of national movements in the 19th century. So there were Polish national movements, Italian national movements, Czech national movements. The Ukrainian movement in the 19th century was very typical. What becomes special, and now we're moving towards the center of our topic, is the 20th century. A lot of these national movements after 1918, after the First World War, become states. There's a Polish state, there's a Lithuanian state. Suddenly what I said became much more important. Sorry, is that too loud? Okay. Is it all right? Okay, somehow it became very loud for me. So there's a Polish state, there's a Lithuanian state, there's a Czechoslovakia, but after 1918, despite a couple of attempts, there's no Ukrainian state. And here Ukraine moves into the middle of a very interesting theme of, you just tell me, it's okay. Okay. All right. I'll just follow what you say. The Ukraine is at the middle of a very important trend in European history, which is the attempt to establish colonies inside Europe itself. So the history of Western Europe for the previous 500 years, roughly since 1492, is the spread of European power around the world. There's an after history to that in the 20th century, which is the attempt to create imperial or colonial type systems inside Europe itself. In different ways, both the Soviets and the Nazis thought they were doing this in Eastern Europe. Stalin, for example, talked about internal colonialism or self-colonialism. What Hitler thought he was up to, and this is not my main subject, but it's interesting and worth knowing, what Hitler thought he was doing in the Second World War was turning Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine, into a German colony. So this last chapter of European domination, where Europeans try to dominate other Europeans, also finds Ukraine right in the middle. And that moves us very close to our topic, which is the Stalinist Soviet Union, the first five-year plan, collectivization, and famine. Okay, so now if you'll permit, I'm going to wind up a little bit the history of Ukraine in the 1920s and 1930s inside the Soviet Union. So it's very important that in order to understand the famine, one has to have a sense, you don't have to be sympathetic to the Soviet Union, but one has to have a sense of what Soviet power was actually about and what the goals were that the Soviet Union was trying to achieve. So the critical thing about the Soviet Union is that it was an attempt to make an industrial revolution in a peasant country. Nobody reads Marx anymore, as far as I know, which is unfortunate since it's a major part of our history. But what Marx said, and just nod when I say this, it'll make me feel good. Thank you, you're already nodding. I like that. I like it when people nod ahead of time. It makes me feel like I'm authorized. What Marx said is that revolutions will happen in industrial countries, where there are big working classes. That was not the Russian Empire. So when the Russian Empire crumbles in 1917, and when a handful of revolutionaries succeed in carrying on revolution in the name of Marxism, they face a basic problem, which is how do you make a Marxist revolution in a country which is populated by basically two social groups, peasants and nomads, right? What do you do with the peasants and the nomads? So that's the basic problem which is there at the setup of the Soviet Union. From the very beginning, from 1917 onward, Ukraine politically is at the center of this struggle. So it's not as though the Russian Empire disappeared and the Soviet Union then magically appeared. There were several years of what's called civil war, but were in fact outright wars along the southern and eastern borders of what became the Soviet Union. And many of these struggles took place in Ukraine. The Russian Civil War, as it's remembered, between the Reds and the Whites, was largely fought in Ukraine. There were also complicated struggles between Ukrainians and Poles inside Ukraine. Then there was a very tricky moment at the end of this where Poles and Ukrainians ally against the Red Army in 1919, which is a very interesting moment, by the way. Just as an aside, I mean, right now in Warsaw and Kiev, everyone is preoccupied with moments of Polish-Ukrainian strife, and no one is remembering that almost exactly 100 years ago, Poles and Ukrainians were fighting together to defend Warsaw against the Red Army, right? But no one seems to be commemorating that, which seems to me to be very important. But however that may be, at the end of all of this, you have a young political officer called Joseph Stalin, who has failed in his struggle against the Polish and Ukrainian allied armies, who was humiliated in 1920 when those allied armies beat back the Red Army at the gates of Warsaw and drive them back into what's now Ukraine and what's now Belarus. At the end of that, you have a Bolshevik revolution which becomes a Soviet state. In other words, it has a boundary, okay? And this is important because if you were Lenin and Trotsky, or if you were one of these revolutionaries, your idea was not to create a Soviet Union. Your idea was a revolution in Europe and around the world. It was only the defeat on the battlefield in 1920 which forced the Bolsheviks to create a state, okay? Which leads then to the next question. Once you have a state, what do you then do? So the first problem was, remember, you've made a revolution in a country, a Marxist revolution in a country of peasants and nomads. Your second problem is, it's not a world revolution. If it were a world revolution, then the workers in Manchester or the workers in Munich, the workers around the world could come and help you, but that didn't happen. So now you have to make what Stalin calls a revolution in one country, right? So in order to create a socialist state, you have to be able to carry out a class struggle in your own country. In order to have that class struggle, you have to have workers. Where do you get the workers? And this is where we have a debate in the late 1920s where Stalin in the end wins. And Stalin's position in the Politburo is to say, in 1928, we are going to collectivize agriculture. Now there are a lot of these terribly boring sounding words in Russian, like, or in other languages of the Soviet Union, like collectivization or dekulakization, which don't sound so terrifying unless you actually think about what they mean. The idea of collectivization was that a country where basically peasants owned the land, either individually in Ukraine or collectively often in Russia, were going to lose all of their land to the state, which is a dramatic social transformation. I mean, if you imagine all the farms in the United States in 1928 suddenly being transformed to state property, that gives you a sense of what we're talking about. The notion was that, talking about Ukraine now, peasants who had basically finally gotten a claim to their own land were going to be told, now there's going to be a machine tractor station, there will be agitators who live in that machine tractor station. That machine tractor station will be in charge of your livestock. You will basically become employees of this machine tractor station. You will no longer have your own plot of land. I don't know how many of you are from peasant or farmer backgrounds. You don't have to raise your hands, but if you are, then you have some sense of what that means to have land and then be told that you're going to lose it. From the local perspective, especially the Ukrainian perspective, where peasants were attached to the idea of private property and many had finally just gotten private property, this was the announcement of a dramatic revolution. From the point of view of Stalin and the Politburo, this is a revolution in a different sense. It was a revolution that had to take place in order to get history back on track. And looking at it from the point of view of the Leninist inheritance, looking at it from the point of view of the ideas that Stalin had, you needed to push history forward These peasants and these nomads, I keep saying nomads because we forget them, but I'll just mention this now in case I don't get to it again. The first famine in the Soviet Union is actually in Kazakhstan, where around 1 million nomads die as they're being forced to settle down and then forced to become workers. And by the way, if you're Ukrainian, you're saying, like, I only want to hear about Ukraine right now. There's no way to understand the Ukrainian famine without thinking about the neighbor population. So in particular, the Kazakh case is very important for you, even if you only care about Ukraine, which I know you don't, but even if you only care about Ukraine, the Kazakh case is very important for you because the Kazakh case shows that Stalin knew that collectivization could lead to mass death a year before it did lead to mass death in Ukraine. So if you're trying to think, what kind of argument can we make that Stalin knew this was possible, the Kazakh history is very important to you. But I would say it's also just very important on its own. Okay, so my point here is that if you're looking at this from Moscow, if you're in the Politburo, you need to get a revolution moving. These peasants and nomads should not exist, right? The modern world is a world of a working class and a small technical intelligentsia. So you have to create the working class. And so in 1929, Stalin calls for, literally, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. Who's a kulak? A kulak is a peasant who, I decide, as a communist, has too much land. That's a kulak. So the idea is that the richer peasants, or maybe the peasants we don't like, or the peasants who are denounced by their neighbors, are going to be removed completely from the scene. And then the other ones are going to be organized into these collective farms. This, by the way, happens 1929, 1930, at the exact moment when the Gulag is established. So the Gulag, as I'm sure all of you know, is a system of concentration camps and special settlements across Siberia, Kazakhstan, which holds, at its height, a couple of million people. This is being built right now. And many of the people who are sent to work in the Gulag are Ukrainians who were defined as kulaks. So Ukrainians who were defined as having too much land. They were sent to places like the Holodomor, which is a canal from the White Sea to the Baltic Sea, which was being built right at this time, 1930. They were sent up there to dig in the freezing cold and very often to die. So in 1930, collectivization takes place. And it takes place in the first 10 weeks of 1930 at a terrifying pace, largely as a result of threats and violence, because people know they could be sent to camps, because people have seen other people disappear. They are forced generally into these collective farms in March of 1930. The problem with this is that a lot of people resist. So if you look at Soviet records, which, as was said in the introductions, we now have, there were nearly 1 million acts of individual resistance in Soviet Ukraine in the first 10 weeks of 1930 to collectivization. These took various forms: running away, trying to cross the border, violent attacks on communists, whatever it might be. But there was serious resistance. And so in March of 1930, Stalin gives his famous speech called Dizzy with Success, which is a hypocritical speech in which he says collectivization is going great. The problem is there's just too much enthusiasm for collectivization. Everyone is too enthusiastic, so we have to slow down. So they do slow down collectivization, and then they bring it back in late 1930, early 1931, with more subtle measures. These involve things that go under the radar a bit, like taxation. If you don't join the collective farm, I'm going to tax you at a rate which will make it impossible for you to keep up your own private plot anyway, for example. Or if you don't join the collective farm, we have the right to confiscate your seed grain, which is one of these technical terms from the countryside that some of you know what that is, right? The seed grain is the grain. If you're a farmer, you have to keep it from one season to plant for the next season. So if I say I have the right to take your seed grain, I'm basically saying I have the right to take your life. So by these less overtly violent means, they managed to get collectivization going again by early 1931. Now, why am I spending all this time on the details? Well, first of all, I'm a historian. I think you should all know this stuff. But secondly, because it's part of the backdrop for why mass starvation starts in 1932. In 1930, they said they collectivized and then they pulled back, which meant that in 1930, the farming was basically still being done by people the same way they had always done it, which meant that the fall 1930 crop was very good. The weather was also nice in 1930, so the yields in 1930 were very good. Why does that matter? It matters because in 1931, when the countryside really was collectivized, the grain requisitions targets were set according to 1930. So it was expected that everywhere in Ukraine, people would be able to turn in as much grain in 1931 as they had turned in 1930. Even though the weather wasn't as good, but more importantly, during that time, there had been this chaotic transition from basically private farming to basically state farming. And even if state farming were as efficient as private farming, which it never was, the transition itself was unbelievably chaotic and would have caused crop yields to go down for a couple of years. So in 1931, the expectations were that there would be a terrific crop in Ukraine, and there wasn't. So here's where we get to the political issue. So if you are governing the Soviet Union, you govern it according to a certain logic. The logic goes like this. We made a revolution in the name of the working class. The working class is represented by the party. The party is represented by the Central Committee. The Central Committee is represented by the Politburo, and the Politburo is represented by whoever manages to dominate the Politburo at a certain moment, which at this point is Comrade Stalin. So if you are Comrade Stalin, you are simultaneously saying everything that's happening is happening not because of me, but because of history, right? History says the working class advances, the kulaks go down. We are just the tools of history. We're just doing what history demands. Therefore, you can't be wrong. You also can't be wrong for the reasons that all tyrants can't be wrong. Once you have all the power in your own hands, everything you do has to be right. It can't be wrong. Try to make a list in your mind of all of the self-critical tyrants out there who you've read about in history, right? It's a pretty short list. So the point here is that there's a pretty straightforward reason why crop yields were down in Ukraine in 1932. And that is that Ukraine was collectivized in 1931. But as in many tyrannical situations, and especially in this specific ideological situation, no one could say that. You could not say that. This thing that I'm saying, you could not say. If you were a lower level, if you were a Ukrainian peasant, you could try saying it to the local communist agitators, right? If you were a local communist agitator and you noticed it, as a lot of people did, you could try saying it to the party leadership in Kharkiv. If you were the party leadership in Kharkiv, you might even then try saying it. A couple of them did to the Politburo in Moscow. But then the signals came back down very clearly. If you try to report to us what is actually going on and why, this means that you were a saboteur, right? This means you're a saboteur. So the abundant factuality that people really were beginning to starve in large numbers by the summer of 1932 runs up against a perfect institutional check. Stalin can't be wrong. So if you try to report it up the chain, what's going to come back down the chain is denial, but also repression of you personally, which means that you are going to learn, well, you're going to be sent to the gulag, but your colleagues or your friends are going to learn not to do the thing that you just did. So by the summer of 1932, we've reached the situation where Stalin himself privately recognizes that there is a famine in Ukraine. He actually uses the word famine to describe Ukraine in June of 1932. By then, about 1 million people are already in pretty advanced stages of hunger. But there's also a very unreal, or if you like, fictional response to this. The targets for the grain requisitions are not changed. The official version of what's happening is that this is sabotage, right? And that goes very far, right? The idea is that, I mean this quite literally, it's going to sound terrifying, but the idea is that if you are starving, you are carrying out sabotage. You are, as one communist in the city put it, you are taking away our optimism by your starvation, right? Your distended belly from starvation is propaganda against the system. That was the line, that this was a form of sabotage against the system. Another unreal response was a famous law in August of 1932, which said that if you possess food, you possess the property of the state. Right? But think about the implications of that. If you have just a few grains of wheat in your pocket, that means you've stolen from the state, right? That sets a very clear line. And the other element of unreality of all of this is the creation of brigades, who were young people, workers, sometimes students from the cities, who were told all the things that I just told you, right? That there wasn't really starvation, that's a matter of sabotage, the peasants are keeping the food to themselves, that's why you're hungry in the cities. So then you're sent out in a group of young people with metal rods, in order to go to the villages and take as much food as you could. And imagine what that led to, right? I mean, it led to these people taking lots of food from the countryside, but it also led to an uncontrolled, extra-legal kind of violence in which people were beaten, in which women were raped, and in which the last vestiges of normality around the situation completely disappeared. So I'm describing to you, and I'll keep describing to you what this is like for the people who suffered it. But I also want to make clear to you politically how important it is that there was this unreality around it all. That the ability of people to understand this kind of thing ideologically had almost no limits. And the fact that people can live in fiction and act on the basis of fiction is a big part of how things could continue to go the way that they went. In late 1932, Stalin memorably described the idea of famine in Ukraine, which, I repeat, he knew was true. Right? He described it as a fairy tale. He again defined starvation as resistance, and this had the interesting implication, as you probably already noticed, that the starving were the aggressors, and he himself, Stalin, and the Soviet system were the victims. And this is very important as well, right? And those of you who have studied other genocides or perhaps are familiar with the history of the Holocaust might notice this similarity, that there is no limit among oppressors of defining themselves as the victims, and there's no limit of oppressors in describing victims as the aggressors. There's just no limit to that. So Stalin does that in late 1932. It's a fairy tale, it's a provocation, this is sabotage. I am the victim, right? I, Stalin, who am traveling in a special train full of food through Ukraine to my special vacation spot at Sochi, I am the victim, and the people who are starving to death outside my train windows, they are the aggressors. In late 1932 and early 1933, the Politburo enforces a set of 7 policies which ensure that the death toll in Ukraine, which might have remained at a few 100,000, goes up into the millions. These policies taken together reveal both an intention to cause what happened, as well as a kind of knowledge of what would be necessary to bring this about. So these policies are, number 1, returning grain advances. So by the way, this is not going to sound as dramatic as a death pit with rifles, right? So it takes a little bit of imagination, especially if you don't come from an agrarian background yourself, to think about the horror of all of this. But remember, we are still in a world where food is a real issue for everyone. And we are, especially in Ukraine in the 1930s, a little bit of food is a matter of life and death. So when I describe what might seem to be like technical administrative measures, try to think about how these would have affected people. So the first one is the grain advances were taken back. What does that mean? If you were one of the relatively few Ukrainian collective farms or villages that actually had met the grain requisitions target, you were rewarded with grain. Now this was taken back from you in late 1932. Number 2, the meat penalty. If you were a collective farm or village which failed to meet the requisitions target, you had to pay a meat penalty. So what does that mean? It means that if you still had a goat or you still had a cow, you had to give that up and it was going to be slaughtered, right? And so what had been your reserve of calories from milk or from meat, you lose, which means it's much more likely that you're going to die. Number 3 were the blacklists. If you were a collective farm or a settlement which failed to meet the requisitions target, you were put on a blacklist. What the blacklist meant was that everywhere in the rest of the Soviet Union, no one was allowed to trade with you. You were shut out from the entirety of the Soviet economy. Right? You can see what consequences that would have had. Number 4, the association of starvation in Ukraine with Ukrainian nationalism. So what this meant was that if you were somebody who said, I have observed starvation, right? The political response from up above was no longer just to deny it. The political response was to say, you are part of a Ukrainian nationalist plot. And this was part of a general trend in the early 1930s to select out the people who were the most gifted Ukrainian artists, painters, writers, poets, architects, people who had done relatively well in the 1920s, and put a great amount of pressure on them, so some of them committed suicide, or simply to send them to the gulag or to have them executed. So defending people from starvation was defined as nationalism, with consequences for everyone who tried to do it. Number 5, I think I'm on, is that the quota, the total delivery quota of 1932 was affirmed. Even though everyone knew Ukrainians were starving, the quota, which could have been reduced significantly, was not reduced significantly. Number 6, the borders of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic were sealed. So I repeat, of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. That meant that if you were in Ukraine and you were trying to go to Belarus for food, as people did, right? I mean, which the Belarusians, by the way, found very strange, because the Belarusians, of course, said, historically, all the food comes from Ukraine. Why are the Ukrainians coming north to Belarus to beg for food, right? So the borders of the Soviet Republic of Ukraine were sealed. Next one, if you were a peasant, you were forbidden from going to the cities. Why is that relevant? Because in this famine, unlike basically every other famine you might hear of, the hunger was more extreme in the countryside than it was in the city. Because remember, the whole idea was to transfer the wealth from the countryside to the city, to build factories and mines and a working class. So the cities, although they were also hungry, and tens of thousands of people starved in the Ukrainian cities, the cities were less hungry than the countryside, and so another measure was to ban peasants from traveling to the city. All of these things taken together amount to a deliberate attempt, clearly a forethought and deliberate attempt, to make sure that the starvation associated with collectivization was located on the territory of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Okay. What were the consequences? I'll say a word about consequences and then a word about what we know, why people didn't know about this at the time, and then I'll be done. So the consequences. One thing which may not be obvious, but which is worth stressing, is that hunger makes politics impossible. So we live in a very strange world, at least most of us, in the West, in the US, in North America, where hunger is no longer part of politics. If I say calories, you probably think I have too many, right? I mean, not me personally, I mean you know. You probably think I have too many. If I say calories are bad, right? I just went to a restaurant where the calories were by every food item, and the idea was that that's because you're getting too many. That's a historically weird, right? It's a historically unusual situation. For most of human history, calories were something you couldn't get enough of. You couldn't get enough of. So I'm asking you to imagine then what it's like to actually be hungry, which I hope none of you has actually experienced. Being hungry is politically deadening. So you can't be a saboteur, you can't do anything in politics if you're actually going hungry. So all forms of politics in the Soviet Republic of Ukraine slowed to a halt in 1932. The next set of consequences I'm going to dwell on. This might be the hardest part. It has to do with children. So in the schools, children were hungry. Children would sometimes write naive letters to the party leaders or even to Stalin personally. I will quote one of them. We should be learning, but we are too hungry to walk. A fairly typical experience of children in schools would be that a fellow child, a classmate, sitting at his desk would at a certain moment simply pass out or seem to pass out, but actually have died. Another experience which was not at all unrepresentative would be that the children would find the severed head of one of their classmates in a forest or in a pond because that child had been either kidnapped and killed or his body sold by cannibals or had been killed by his own parents. It just gets worse after that, but I will stop there. Those are the typical social experiences of children in 1932 or 1933. Cannibalism was widespread. This is one of the reasons why Ukrainians then and now had a hard time talking about this particular episode of mass killing. One recollection which stays with me is of a child who told his brother, "Mother says we should eat her if she dies." So that was normal. And that, of course, was an expression of that mother's love for her children, if you think about it. And that kind of thing was all too common. Second set of consequences. Let's think for a moment about the cities. So what parents did, if they wanted their children to survive, staying with the children for a moment, is they sent them out of the countryside. They would put signs around their necks, or they would put a note in their pocket saying who they were, and they would try to get them on a train into the cities, on the logic that the child would be more likely to survive with the help of total strangers in the city than with his own parents back home. And unfortunately, that was probably true. But many of those children, of course, died. When they were in the cities, they created a spectacle. Remember how important illusion is in all of this. They created a spectacle which was very undesirable for Soviet authorities. So in all of the major Soviet Ukrainian cities, maybe Kharkiv was the worst, daily the police cleared the children from the sidewalks and took them and locked them into barracks somewhere outside. So in Kharkiv on any given day, there were about 20,000 children who were locked in basements, which the children referred to as the death barracks. And the idea was that here they would starve, but out of sight of the city dwellers, out of sight of the diplomats. Remember, Kharkiv is the capital of Soviet Ukraine at this time. Out of sight of any journalists, although of course there weren't very many. I'm going to say some more about that. People did die, as I said, in the cities on the scale of the tens of thousands, but the striking thing was that most of the death was actually in the countryside. The vast majority of Ukrainians who died were in southern Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, north central Ukraine, central Ukraine, in the countryside. And the consequences were not just, right? In late 1932 and through 1933, something on the order of 4 million people die of starvation and related diseases. And you have to work to think of that not just as a number, right? That's an extraordinary number over a very short period of time, right? If you're in the back of your mind, you're comparing this to the Holocaust, only the period of 1942 and the Holocaust compares with this in terms of the sheer number of deaths over a short period of time. So you have to think of those 4 million people who were killed. In my book, there's a funny saying which is basically true: the lower the estimate, the better the scholar. So in my book, I stay very close to what I think is the documented number as a minimum, which is 3.3 million. Research by demographers since has convinced me that the number was probably more like 3.8, 3.9 million, which is what I'm going to say now. But the important thing is the number, but also imagining that number in terms of individuals. Right? Imagine the repercussion of one death and then try to imagine that 4 times, 4,000 times, 400,000 times, 4 million times over such a short period. It's absolutely devastating to think about for the survivors, partly because, and this is the second consequence beside the death, the trauma of the survivors themselves, because it's not just that people experience this in the sense of seeing it, of witnessing it. Almost everybody in Ukraine was in some sense party to this in one way or another, right? There was only so much food to go around, and to make a terrible point, the good people generally died first. That is, the people who were unwilling to do certain things to survive were usually the people who died first. So then there's the trauma, the ethical trauma of what it meant to have survived in all of this. There's the complete transformation of the countryside. So Ukraine at the time is like the evidence of the nice embroidered shirts that you see around you, right? Ukraine was a peasant society at the time, with its own folkways, which were basically completely destroyed by this. Peasants were taken, the peasants who were doing the best were taken out of their villages and sent to Siberia or to the cities. The other peasants were turned against one another or died in very large numbers, and people stopped being individual farmers. They started being collective farmers. So a whole way of being, a Ukrainian peasant way of being or Ukrainian farmer way of being was more or less eliminated over the course of these few years. With that went a huge blow to the Ukrainian church, which the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which was part, of course, of Ukrainian society. By the way, it's a useful reminder when we think about the experience of the victims to remember that this was not just a peasant society, it was still as late as 1933 very much a religious society. So the oncoming of collectivization was experienced by many Ukrainian peasants as literally the end of the world, right? The end of this way of being in the world, and all of this mass death was experienced as the end of the world in a biblical sense, in an apocalyptic sense, that this is literally Satan walking the earth. So if one reads the primary sources about this, I mean primary sources in the sense of the recollections of people who survived, in fact people who didn't survive sometimes, but what they wrote down and what we have, it's very, they're not talking about it in the political administrative way, which I'm talking about it. They're very often talking about it in that way. The world is coming to an end. Satan is abroad in the world. And of course, that's not wrong. I mean, from their point of view, it's not just the death, it's that a whole way of life has gone away, is being destroyed, right? And it's in that sense, by the way, that's what the word genocide means. I mean, this is an issue which draws a lot of attention. I hope I don't have to spend all of Q&A talking about it. But when Raphael Lemkin talked about what genocide was, Raphael Lemkin is the person who wrote the definition, who made up the word genocide and then wrote a definition of it, and that definition became part of international law. When he said that the Ukrainian famine was a typical Soviet genocide, he didn't just mean that a lot of people died. What he had in mind was the destruction of a way of being in the world. Not just the death, but that way of existing in the world had become impossible. Okay, so why doesn't everybody know about this? This is the last thing I want to talk about. Why doesn't everyone know about this? I mean, as a historian, I'm always struck by the kind of nice American faith that if something is true, then we'll know about it. Unfortunately, that is not at all what being a historian teaches you. What being a historian teaches you is that the truth always has a really, really hard time getting out. And the whole, there's no magical factory which produces the facts and spreads them. That doesn't happen, right? People have to work really hard and take risks, right? There was a remarkable French philosopher called Simone Weil who said that fiction is free, but every fact has a price. And that applies very strongly to this particular case. So what happens if there are no reporters? What happens if there are no reporters? A question which is not only relevant to that moment, by the way. What happens if there are no reporters? There were virtually no reporters talking about what I'm talking about. The things that I'm talking about we know because in the 1980s, when it started to be possible, Ukrainians went around and collected what we would call in the Holocaust context witness testimonies. We know because we have access to the Soviet documents, especially in Ukrainian archives. We know because we have access to the sources now, okay, but it's taken about 80 years to put together a coherent picture of what happened back then. Why? And one of the simple answers is reporters. There were not reporters reporting on this. It was illegal if you were a reporter in the Soviet Union at this time to go to Ukraine. There were 2 reporters writing in English who did a credible job. One of them was Malcolm Muggeridge of the Manchester Guardian, who wrote several good articles without a byline. The only person, to my knowledge, writing in English with a byline, that is with his own name on the articles, was Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist who made his way under false pretenses, took a train to Kharkiv, jumped off on the way, and wrote about the famine very movingly and quite accurately in the Kharkiv region. But my point is, that's not very much, right? 2 reporters for 4 million deaths is not very much. And they were working against a general climate in Moscow, which was personified by a New York Times reporter called Walter Duranty, which was something like, you have to make an omelet, you have to break some eggs, right? Or as it goes in Russian, when you chop down trees, chips will fly. That was the basic idea, that sure, there were some costs and some people suffered, but those people come from a world which is passing anyway, and what's happening is that we're bringing about a brighter world, a brighter future for everyone. So it's it's such a simple point that you have to have reporters. If you don't have human beings in the place where something is happening, it's very hard to know. Second thing, there were very strong ideological attacks on the people who did try to report. So who knew about this? Quite a few people, actually, and among them, and Elena hinted at this already, were Ukrainian activists in interwar Poland and in interwar Romania. Because remember, at that time, there was a big Ukrainian minority in Romania and in Poland. The Ukrainians in Poland and Romania knew very well what was happening in Ukraine because, especially at the beginning, Ukrainians were fleeing across the border, right, in the thousands, and that was enough. But also they were getting letters, and some of them were still traveling back and forth. So there was a very clear idea. And interestingly, it was the most important Ukrainian feminist, Milena Dudnitska, who was at. I'm going to say that name again because she's a very important person, and not everybody knows about her. Milena Dudnitska was her name. She tried and she was multilingual, very smart, very well connected. She's probably the person who tried the hardest to get the word out. She worked in the League of Nations. She actually got the League of Nations to hold a closed session about what we now call the Holodomor. But these people were all stopped because the moment that they tried to make some kind of public appeal, they were met with a very strong ideological backlash ordered from the Soviet Union, which said, if you were against this, you were on the side of the fascists, which is a refrain which Ukrainians at various points have had to deal with, including very recently. So the idea was that if you were criticizing the Soviet project, then you must be on the side of the fascists, right? So if you talk about this famine, it's not that you're talking about the facts or you care about people suffering, you must be on the side of the fascists. But one notable attempt to gain attention to this tragedy and to organize relief was carried out by Cardinal Initzer in Vienna. He was probably the person of the highest profile in Europe who tried to do something about the famine. The Soviets then criticized him as a fascist and said, in the Soviet Union we have neither cardinals, he was an archbishop and a cardinal, we have neither cardinals nor cannibalism, which was sadly only half true. The other thing that the Soviets did, and again some of this might sound familiar, is they organized counter-propaganda in the form of counter-spectacle. So they, for example, this is the most notorious example, they invited a prominent French politician called Edouard Herriot. They invited him for a kind of Potemkin village tour of Ukraine, in which he was in places where people were starving to death within miles of where he was, but they would organize a school where everything was just fine, and they would organize food for the children in that school, at least for a few days, and then he would go to the school and he would say, how's everything? And the students would say, great. And he would say, what did you have for lunch today? And they would tell him, and so then Herriot went back to the West and said everything was fine. And it may seem like that's too simple, but unfortunately things work that way, and they still work that way. If you can get one or a few very prominent people who are prominent in the target countries to come and tell your story, yes, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? It can make a great deal of difference in public opinion. So that's something else the survivors did. The diplomats. Aside from the West Ukrainians, the other group of people who knew all about this were the diplomats. The Germans, the Italians, and the Poles especially. Probably especially the Poles, because the Poles had consuls all over the place. The Poles all spoke Russian, many of them spoke Ukrainian. The Poles had a pretty advanced network of contacts throughout Ukraine, because remember at this time there was a very large Polish population, not just in Galicia, but also in Soviet Ukraine. They traveled around Poland, they traveled around Ukraine in their own automobiles, and if you read the correspondence, which I have done of Polish diplomats back to Warsaw, it's extraordinary. I mean, some of the most awful descriptions of what's happening in Ukraine actually come from the Polish diplomatic pouch, and of course they had no reason to exaggerate this in any way. They were simply reporting what they had seen. Another source, by the way, was that, as you can easily imagine, the Polish consuls in Kharkiv were besieged by petitions from Ukrainians who had some kind of Polish origin saying, let us come to Poland, right? Because they were dying. So they would come to the Polish consul and they'd explain what was happening to them and ask to go back and ask to go to Poland, which they generally were not allowed to do. So Polish diplomats. Why didn't the Polish diplomats talk about this? It's very simple. In July of 1932, Poland and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression declaration. So from that point forward, the Poles had no reason to, they were trying to improve relations with the Soviet Union. They had no reason to try to criticize the Soviet Union publicly. And note the date, July 1932. That's right at the moment when the famine starts to become mass death. Right? So if you want great sources on the Holodomor and you read Polish, there are an awful lot of them. An awful lot of them, but the Polish state didn't do anything about this. But before you get too down on Poland, remember that the United States of America was not in such a different situation. There were also Ukrainian feminists and others who were trying to draw attention to the President of the United States, to his wife and others about what's happening in Ukraine. They didn't get a hearing because it was the Great Depression. And the main concern of American policymakers was to have diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and to have trade with the Soviet Union. Okay, final reason, the people who lived through this were inside the Soviet Union. Very simple point, I know, but the people who survived this very rarely left the Soviet Union to get a hearing somewhere else. There are only a few exceptions. Like Kravchenko, for example, Viktor Kravchenko, who wrote a book called I Chose Freedom, who at the time was a communist apparatchik in Ukraine. But there aren't that many examples of people who actually saw it, who then ended up in the West where they could write about it. So history and memory aren't the same thing, right? Everybody likes memory. Memory makes us feel good. You have your memory, I have my memory. But history is also really important, and you can't do history without sources. So if you can control the sources or intimidate the sources at the beginning, you can make it very hard for historians later on. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, why I see this exhibition, which is very good and which is just a couple of 100 meters over that way, this exhibition and other things as very positive developments. I mean, there are scholarly books now that are written about this. Anne Applebaum has just written a book about the famine. It's chapter one of one of my books. And there's also, while I'm plugging things, there's also a feature film called Mr. Jones by the outstanding Polish filmmaker Agnieszka Holland, which is just debuted, which is about Gareth. It's lightly fictionalized, but it gives you the basic story of Gareth Jones and his journey to Moscow and then to Kharkiv. There have been several films about the Holodomor, but I have a feeling that this one probably will make a difference in terms of the general memory. Because again, there's a difference between history and memory sometimes exists because of things people do in art, right? And sometimes it's most important when people beyond your own community do something in art. Although, by the way, Mr. Jones had a lot of Ukrainians involved in it. Okay. So the very last thing I wanted to talk about, again, there's no clock up there, so for all I know, we've been here for 5 hours. But the very last thing I wanted to talk about, now you're all looking at your watches, don't do that makes me feel bad. The very last thing I wanted to talk about was a couple of resonances across from the Holodomor to the Holocaust. Because as I say, for me, it's a very important thing. This is the first time, right? I think as far as we know, this is the first time this has happened. You're taking part in something which is very interesting, that there's a Holodomor exhibition inside a Holocaust museum. But for me as a historian, there are all kinds of resonances, right? And when I speak of resonances, by the way, I'm not trying to say that these are the same thing, because they're not. But there are ways in which each of them helps us to understand the other, and I'm going to mention a couple of them. One of them are sources. So you could write about the Holodomor only on the basis of the Jewish sources, if you had to. Why is that? Because in all of these American and other projects to gather what we think of as, what's that? You're saying hi, 5 minutes left. I'm number 5. Okay. In all of these attempts, whether it's USC or whether it's us at Yale, if you ask enough Jews about their life in Eastern Europe, some of them will talk about the famine in Ukraine, because that's part of their life, right? Because Ukraine is where the Jews are from. Ukraine and Poland, that's where most of the Jews in the world are from. So if you collect enough testimonies and you have people talking about their young lives in the 1930s, they will start talking about the Holodomor, right? In the case of the USC collection, they actually started a separate project because they were listening to these testimonies and they just literally didn't know what the Jews were talking about. And so then they set up, to their credit, a separate project to try to figure out what the Holodomor is. This is true of the Yale testimonies. It's true of all Jewish sources of the Second World War. If you read them carefully, you realize, oh, they're talking about the Holodomor because they experienced it. An awful lot of Jews in the countryside in Ukraine died in the Holodomor, as did a lot of Poles and a lot of Russians, a lot of other people. I mean, the main victims were people who identified as Ukrainian, but it was people who lived in the countryside in Ukraine who died. So the sources are also one very prominent and obvious connection. A second connection is that the world that was disassembled in Ukraine in 1933, I talked about it as a Ukrainian peasant world, but it wasn't just that. It was also a world in which Jews lived in the countryside, right? They were moving quickly to the city, as many Ukrainians were, but it was still a Jewish world in the countryside in 1932, 1933, and still, to a pretty considerable extent, a traditional Jewish world with Yiddish and with Shabbat and so on, with the observation of kosher laws. Think about what happened to that during the famine, right? The famine in Ukraine was a very violent prod in the direction of the secularization, the dispersion of traditional Jewish life in Ukraine as well. So the world that was taken apart in those years was the Ukrainian world, but it wasn't only a Ukrainian world. Another similarity has to do with the purpose of it all. So I'm going to go back to something I said at the beginning. I hope this is not too general, but what Stalin was trying to do, and these are his words, was to colonize itself, to colonize the Soviet Union, to colonize the parts of the Soviet Union that could be colonized. The places that had an excess, as they thought about it, people, grain, had to be exploited for the other parts. That is also what Hitler was trying to do with Ukraine. So in the exhibition, there's the nice word breadbasket, which is exactly how Hitler talked about Ukraine. When the Germans invade in 1941 the Soviet Union, what they're mainly thinking about is the breadbasket of Ukraine. If the Soviets don't invade the Soviet Union in 1941, there would be no Holocaust as we know it. There were lots of other causes as well, but I just want to note that colonial desire to control Ukraine is important in both the Holodomor as it is in the Holocaust. This is still a world of scarcity. And then I want to notice one more connection, which I was touched to see in the museum this morning when I visited. In the museum, there's a list of the main mortal victims of German policy under National Socialism, and number 2 are Soviet prisoners of war, who nobody remembers, right? Because they're not national victim groups. But a little more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in camps. A lot of those people were Ukrainians, and if you read the sources from those people, the ones who survived, what do they talk about? They say, the Germans starved me in this prisoner of war camp, much as I was starved in 1932, right? So I'm trying to get across another similarity, which is that these two tragedies, the German occupation and Soviet aggressive policies towards its own population, largely happened in the same place. They hit different people with different severity. Again, I'm not trying to say that these are all the same thing, but they happen in the same place, and we find these unexpected connections. Okay. So the very last thought that I want to leave you with, though, is a hopeful one. Because the point of history is not to say, just to repeat, it's not to say, now that I understand your tragedy, I see that it's just like my tragedy. It's never like that. It's never just like it. It's certainly not to say, now that I understand my tragedy, I'm going to forget all about your tragedy, right? That's a temptation that too many of us fall prey to, but that certainly isn't what history is about. History is a humanity, and in every humanity, the effort is always to recognize what's human in people who we don't actually know, right? And this is the final resonance that I want to talk about. It's the hopeful one. It's the one that's exemplified by this very exhibition in this museum, and that is that one can hope that if you are aware of what's happened to the people with whom you identify, that will make it easier for you to recognize what happened to someone else. That's not easy necessarily, but that it's possible. It's possible if you try, right? It's possible with history. So I'm very happy to be with you at this particular point in history when such an effort is being made. Thank you very much.